SeaWorld is keeping a close eye on a killer whale blamed for killing a trainer.
The crowd at Ocean Realm Park expected another flawless routine between trainer and killer whale. But for 20-year-old Rachel Langford, the show became a nightmare. As she leaned toward the water in a practiced move, what followed was sudden and savage. At first, the stunned audience thought it was staged, but it wasn't. Rachel never surfaced again. And her final moment wasn't just tragic. It sparked global outrage, exposed the dark truth of captivity, and forever changed marine parks. Borrowed time with a predator. Rachel Langford thought she knew him, trusted him, even loved him. But with a predator, trust is nothing more than borrowed time. Rachel Langford had given everything to Kraken, the park's star Orca. 6 tons of raw muscle and instinct, wrapped in black and white. Years of patience, endless hours spent building that fragile bridge between human and predator. But on that February afternoon, all of it shattered. What began as a flawless performance turned into a nightmare unraveling second by second, while the audience sat frozen in disbelief, watching the ocean reclaim one of its own. Because Rachel's story didn't begin in that tank, it began long before, in a place about as far from the ocean as anyone could imagine. Rachel had never stood by the ocean, but somehow, it had always lived inside her. While other kids played with dolls or chased fireflies on summer nights, she sat cross-legged on the carpet with a stack of old encyclopedias, flipping through the pages until the spines cracked. She memorized dolphin species, like other kids memorized baseball stats. She could sketch the curve of an orca's dorsal fin from memory. She even practiced mimicking the high-pitched calls of bottlenose pods until her throat burned. Her parents didn't get it. How could they? They lived in a quiet countryside surrounded by farmland, far from the ocean. But Rachel never asked if. For her, it was only ever a matter of when. On her 13th birthday, the dream she had carried for years finally came true. After 2 long days on the road, she reached California and stepped through the gates of Ocean Realm Park, a sprawling marine park on the edge of the coast. There, for the very first time, she saw an orca not on a page or a screen, but alive before her eyes. Her heart pounded. The giant moved with a power that was hypnotic, its black and white skin shining like polished stone. The sight stole her breath away. What she could not have known was that she was staring at the animal who would one day drag her to her death. She didn't scream or clap like the other kids. She didn't even blink. She just stared, breath caught in her chest, as if the world had finally shifted into focus. In that instant, a quiet vow settled within her, not to simply visit the ocean, but to live in its shadows, to learn its language, and one day to stand in the water beside giants. That promise guided everything that came next. At 18, she entered Ocean Realm not as a trainer, but with a mop in her hand, a bucket at her side, and a job in sanitation. While others cheered from the stands, Rachel scrubbed salt off the glass, hauled buckets of fish, and picked scraps out of drains. She wasn't anywhere near the spotlight. But every day, she watched. Every routine, every cue, every mistake. And little by little, the girl who once sketched fins in a bedroom in the Midwest was inching closer to the creatures she believed she was meant to belong to. Beneath the applause. At Ocean Realm Park, Rachel's workday didn't end when the crowds went home. While others finished cleaning up and clocked out, she stayed on the pool deck with her notebook open, documenting every detail of the whales' behavior. She watched how they moved after a long day of shows, the flick of a tail, a pause before surfacing, the way they responded to trainers when no audience was watching. For Rachel, this was her real job, studying the subtle signals, the unspoken trust between human and animal, and recording patterns that most people overlooked. Her focus wasn't on the whistles or hand cues, but on the quiet moments in between, the parts of training that revealed whether trust was building or breaking. And over time, the rest of the staff began to notice her dedication. Slowly, her role began to change, from cleaning crew to assistant technician, from apprentice to trainer. And then one day she stood right where she had always dreamed, knee-deep in the water, whistle in hand, with an orca beside her. But Rachel's gift was never in the stunts or the applause. It was in the way she carried herself around the animals. She treated them not as props in a show, but as old souls marked by scars, each carrying stories the audience would never hear. While others focused on creating flashy performances, Rachel created puzzles and challenges meant to keep their minds sharp and alive. The dolphins came to trust her. The belugas leaned into her touch, and eventually, all of it led her to Kraken. Kraken was not just another whale. He carried 6 tons of history, and most of it was scarred with pain. Born beneath the northern lights, he spent his earliest years chasing herring through the cold Norwegian seas, surrounded by song and family, until the nets closed in. One moment, he was racing through silver schools of fish. The next, he was dragged upward, torn from his mother, and lowered into a concrete tank. That was how captivity began for him. From then on, his life became a cycle of transfers, each move stripping him further from the world he once knew. He was weighed, branded, renamed, and paraded before crowds like a living trophy. He learned the commands, but never trusted them. He performed because he had to, but he never forgot. Among the trainers, there was always a dark story people spoke about in whispers. Someone had gone into Kraken's pool and barely made it out. On paper, it was brushed off as an accident, and the file was tucked away, like it never happened. But those who worked close to him couldn't forget. They remembered the silence that followed, the empty wet suit pulled from the water, and the way everyone avoided looking at each other that night. From then on, it felt like a shadow followed Kraken wherever he went, a reminder that no amount of training could erase what lived inside him. Some whales adapted to captivity, but Kraken never did. He drifted in isolation, his body heavy with stillness, ignoring cues, rejecting food, sometimes refusing to move at all. To most trainers, Kraken was a ticking time bomb. His violent outbursts were no secret. He had once pinned a trainer underwater and another time refused to let go of a handler's arm until others rushed in. His sheer weight and muscle made him impossible to control if he decided to resist. Even the way he swam carried an edge, sudden bursts of speed that hinted at instincts no training could erase. To Rachel, though, he was not just a threat in waiting. Where others saw danger, she saw a wounded soul. Where most kept their distance, she believed she could reach the part of him that still wanted trust. A creature she thought was not dangerous, only misunderstood. What she never knew, what Kraken carried within him every single day, was that the ocean had never truly released its hold on him. He still remembered the cold waters, he still remembered the songs, and somewhere deep inside, he had never stopped hearing them. When trust snapped. Nothing about February 16, 1999, foreshadowed disaster. The morning was ordinary, with clear skies and water undisturbed. Backstage, Rachel was already zipped into her wetsuit. Calm, steady. She'd done this routine more times than she could count. And Kraken had been better than usual. Quick to respond, even playful. Trainers called it progress. Rachel called it trust. The show opened on cue. Music filled the air, lights danced across the pool, and the crowd leaned forward. Kraken burst from the water in a clean breach that soaked the front row, and laughter rippled through the seats. Rachel gave another signal, this time calling for a spin, and to the audience it seemed like pure magic, though between her and the whale there was nothing mystical at all, only signals and trust. Then came the finale, the side-by-side dive, a mirrored breach. Rachel stepped to the very edge and lifted her arm for the final cue, but in that single moment, everything changed. Kraken shifted without warning, moving silently and fast, his jaws closing around the base of her ponytail. At first, it looked almost gentle, but then came the pull, a sudden blur of motion, and before the crowd could even grasp what they were witnessing, the water had swallowed her whole. Gasps erupted. A few people even clapped, thinking it was all part of the act. But seconds ticked by. Rachel didn't surface. Kraken didn't let go. The shift was unmistakable now. The cheers turned into silence, and then into screams. The first came from a child in the third row, finger raised as the calm surface broke into chaos. Foam exploded where moments earlier there had only been grace. Rachel disappeared beneath the surface, and in an instant, Kraken was no longer performing. His body thrashed, twisting with violent force, his massive tail slicing through the water like a blade. Trainers blew their whistles and tossed fish into the pool, desperate to distract him, but nothing made him release his hold. He pulled her under, then forced her back up, only to drag her down again, each surge more brutal than the one before. The audience didn't know if they were watching a show or a nightmare. Some filmed, some shielded their children's eyes, but what they were witnessing wasn't theater. It wasn't a stunt, it was a killing. The deadly scene. The stadium erupted in chaos. Red emergency lights bathed the concrete walls, and the sirens, they weren't just noise. They were like warning bells from another world, telling everyone in that place they had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. Backstage, panic erupted the moment staff understood what was unfolding. Team members rushed to their emergency stations, every movement drilled into them from countless rehearsals that suddenly became real. The call went out as Code Black, the signal that an orca had turned aggressive and a trainer had been dragged into the water. As Kraken exploded through the surface of the pool, with Rachel's limp body dragged beside him like a rag doll, her arms spread wide, her hair streamed across the water, her wetsuit torn apart. It was no longer part of a routine or a show. It was raw power on display, holding on to life or deciding to end it. Seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity as trainers scrambled in desperation, shouting his name, blowing whistles, tossing lures, flashing signals, trying every trick they had ever used to reach him. But from the very beginning, it was clear that nothing would work. Kraken was no longer performing. He was not confused, and he was not unaware. He simply did not care. Divers went in, nets were cast, emergency lines were pulled, but every effort failed. Each one only driving Kraken deeper into rage as he circled with deadly precision. For 30 agonizing minutes, the terrified audience sat frozen in their seats, forced to watch, as hope slowly bled out of the pool. Finally, they managed to lure Kraken into the isolation pen. Only then could they recover Rachel. And when they did, she was unrecognizable. The autopsy would later record it in cold clinical terms. Massive blunt force trauma, multiple fractures, drowning, nothing more than words on paper. But no medical report could capture what it felt like to see it. To see a woman so devoted to the ocean be swallowed by it in front of thousands. The park shut down instantly. Guests were ushered out in silence. No announcements, no reassurances, just the hollow buzz of radios and the sound of dripping water echoing off the walls. A stretcher rolled past, covered in a soaked white sheet, and that was it. Ocean Realm had died that day, too, right alongside her. And then came the headlines, blunt and unforgiving. Trainer killed by killer whale. Orca turns violent during live show. But if you had been there, you would know those words barely touched the truth. What unfolded wasn't just a show gone wrong, it was the moment spectacle gave way to reality. The belief that humans could choreograph nature, that trust alone could tame danger, shattered in that tank. For years, the crowd had clapped at splashes and cheered at smiles, convinced the trainers were in control. That belief drowned with Rachel. And Kraken, floating silent and still in the center of the pool afterward, made the truth brutally clear. Wildness cannot be caged. It can only be delayed. The investigation moved quickly as authorities examined footage, staff accounts, and incident reports. And what surfaced was damning, with ignored warnings, documented aggression, and red flags buried beneath ticket sales and show schedules. Rachel's name spread across the world, remembered not as a rising star, but as a symbol. To some, she was seen as a martyr of devotion, a woman who loved too deeply to walk away, while to others, she stood as a painful reminder of what happens when instinct collides with illusion. Outside the park gates, grief split into two voices that rose together. Justice for Rachel and free Kraken, carried in the chants of protesters, reflected in the glow of candles, and marked by the flowers and handwritten signs left behind in mourning. Because on that day, the ocean didn't just take Rachel, it took away a belief, one so many had clung to for decades, that nature could be scripted, that the sea could be controlled. And once you've seen that illusion break, you never forget it. The aftermath. There was never silence, only a statement. That same afternoon, Ocean Realm Park released it, neat and sympathetic, carefully rehearsed. They called it a tragedy, but never admitted it was one that didn't have to happen. Behind the scenes, trainers were told to keep their mouths shut. No interviews, no comments, but some couldn't stay quiet. Whispered accounts began to slip out, confirming what many had feared all along. Kraken had been showing signs for months. He wasn't ready. Truth is, he never would be. Rachel's family stepped forward next, not with rage, but with purpose. They didn't want pity. They wanted accountability, not just for her, but for every trainer who had ever been asked to trust a predator in the name of entertainment. And slowly, the spotlight shifted. This wasn't about a single death anymore. It was about an entire system built on denial. The tank wasn't the only thing cracking that day. So was the illusion. Kraken never performed again. After Rachel's death, he was moved to an off-exhibit tank where there was no music, no lights, and no cheering crowds, only the constant hum of pumps and the hollow sound of water against concrete. Some described it as punishment, others as mercy. But whatever it was silence. But Ocean Realm Park couldn't escape the noise outside its walls. According to reports, attendance plummeted and sponsors cut ties. School trips that once filled the stands were canceled overnight. The park's reputation, once sparkling with wonder, was now stained with blood. And beyond the gates, something bigger began to stir. Federal mandates rolled out. Trainers were banned from entering tanks during live shows. Reports alleged that the National Wildlife Safety Agency began sweeping audits of marine parks across the country. And for the first time, the sound of applause was replaced by a wave of questions. Her image, once framed by ocean spray and stage lights, became something else entirely. Not a failure, a sacrifice. A woman who loved the sea so deeply she forgot it could still hurt her. And that changed everything. Orcas no longer looked like playful performers. They were wild. They were intelligent. They were captives. And no amount of choreography could hide that anymore. Rachel Langford never set out to start a movement. She just wanted to belong. In the end, it wasn't her voice, but her loss that echoed loudest. She didn't die chasing fame. She died believing that trust could be earned, that wildness could be understood, that maybe love was enough. But the ocean doesn't bend to belief. It doesn't care how long you've trained, or how much you love, or how gently you speak. It remembers what we forget. Behind every trick is instinct, and behind every applause, a risk. Kraken wasn't a monster. Rachel wasn't naive. They were both captives of the same system, one that sold wonder without warning. Now, all that remains is silence. And the question that silence leaves behind: what is the cost of taming the untamable? And for many of the staff members at Ocean Gate, they were forced to look back on the one moment where Kraken had shown signs that he could harm someone, anyone. The sad part, he could harm his loved ones too. This is the story of Kraken they tried to hide. It all began with a reckless worker dragged into darkness. Daniel Dukes wasn't just a thrill-seeker. He was also a low-level technician contracted to clean and inspect filtration systems at SeaWorld's animal tanks. Known for pushing limits and bending rules, Dukes often took shortcuts to save time or impress colleagues. But one night, his recklessness collided with a very real responsibility. He'd been scheduled to check a malfunctioning drain valve near Kraken's isolation pool. The area was supposed to be off-limits without backup, but Dukes went in alone. Some say he was dared by co-workers. Others believe he wanted to get closer to the Orca than anyone else ever had. But Kraken wasn't a creature to impress. Still adjusting to captivity, Kraken had only recently been transferred to the facility. He was massive, temperamental, and unpredictable. Trainers were still working to establish a rapport with him. Kraken didn't trust humans, especially not strangers who entered his space unannounced. What happened next would scar SeaWorld's legacy forever. Security footage later revealed that Dukes slipped through a service hatch and entered the edge of the pool deck. Possibly hoping to calm Kraken, he crouched and spoke to him. But within seconds, the Orca lunged. Dukes was yanked from the platform and pulled into the water. He fought to surface, but Kraken thrashed violently, biting and dragging him across the tank. One employee, who witnessed the scene from a monitoring station, triggered the emergency protocol. It took several trainers using decoy signals and nets to distract Kraken long enough to reach Dukes. By then, the damage was catastrophic. His body was shredded and unrecognizable. The lower half was mutilated. His face was torn beyond repair. And still, Kraken circled the tank, holding the body with a terrifying possessiveness, as if daring anyone to take it. Dukes survived, but barely. He spent weeks in critical care, underwent more than a dozen surgeries, and never regained full mobility. His psychological state deteriorated rapidly. He couldn't sleep. He rarely spoke. He had nightmares every night about being pulled back into the tank. But what came next was worse. Internally, the facility knew Kraken had become a liability. But management also knew the Orca had become a crowd favorite. He drew record ticket sales, merchandise, and media attention. Executives gathered behind closed doors and made a decision. Dukes would be blamed. They argued he shouldn't have entered alone, that he ignored safety rules, that his reckless past made him unreliable. Kraken, on the other hand, was a star. He brought in revenue. He symbolized resilience. He was too valuable to lose. Dukes was quietly compensated and asked to sign an NDA. The official story said he had trespassed. Few questioned it, until it happened again. Rachel, a junior trainer, was working a solo shift when Kraken struck. This time, there was no rescue. Her body was pulled apart before help could arrive. Only then was Kraken put down. It was too late to save Rachel, and too late to undo the damage. But perhaps just in time to stop it from happening again. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.